Good afternoon and welcome. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 22 from the AMSCO AP US History textbook. Chapter 22 is all about World War I, both the US's role before they joined, their role in World War I, a little bit of the aftermath, and then a huge focus on the home front, so how World War I affected those back home. So looking from 1914 to 1918 today, you can kind of see how I've got my notes set up here. Looking at the war itself, debate over whether the US should join, their actual entry into the war, and then how it affected Americans on the home front. Now, a little bit of context first. World War I is from 1914 to 1918. And so when you think about, okay, what's been going on during this time period? Well, this is after the Gilded Age, after the Progressive Era, but also the US is becoming a world power. So the US is starting, let's say, to become a world power, but this is mostly just in the Western Hemisphere. They're not venturing much farther out beyond the Americas. And industrialization with the Gilded Age and whatnot has led to rapid economic growth in the US, although what we'll see is that they don't have a huge military. So the first part of today is going to be a lot of review because you all had me last year, regardless of whether you were on World History or AP Euro. One of the last things that we studied before COVID shut everything down was the causes of World War I, specifically the main causes. You might remember the M stands for militarism, the A for alliances, the I for imperialism, and the N for nationalism. Militarism means that every nation's building up huge armies. They're ready to go to war. Especially Germany's ready to go to war and show off their military. The alliances dragged all of these countries into a war, turning a small conflict into a massive world war. Imperialism, as countries are competing for colonies, that leads to conflict and tension. And then nationalism, kind of this blind loyalty to your nation. Countries are willing to do just about anything to defend their country's honor. And so we talked about how Europe was like a powder keg or like a barrel of gunpowder. So full of tension, so full of conflict, just waiting for some spark to blow it all to hell. And that spark was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, June 28, 1914. It was a small conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, but Russia joins to help out Serbia, Germany joins to help out Austria-Hungary, then France joins to defend Russia, and then Germany invades France through what's called the Schlieffen plan. They go through Belgium, which pissed off England, so England joins, and all of a sudden this small conflict becomes a massive world war. Now, when World War I begins, the US was officially neutral. They refused to take a side. Let me actually pause here beforehand. So again, we've got our main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. And it is an interesting conversation to ask about, like, which of these applied to the US? The US did not really have a very large military. So I wouldn't say the US was a militaristic nation. The US also did not join any of these alliances, so that doesn't apply. Okay, imperialism, that applies. The US had colonies, especially after the Spanish-American War, although they're not necessarily going to competing with Europeans for those colonies. I guess they went to war with Spain, but no major conflicts. And then nationalism, sure, there's some American nationalism, but maybe not on the levels of in Europe. And so an interesting point to clarify is that militarism and alliances kind of do not apply to the US. And so when the war finally begins, the US is officially neutral. President Woodrow Wilson at the time and through the rest of the war, he maintained official American neutrality. And what we'll see as we dig through this PowerPoint is that American sentiment was somewhat divided on what side the US should support. Most Americans were anti-Germany, pro-English France alliance. But the majority of Americans also supported isolationism and neutrality. Just to emphasize that again, a majority of Americans supported an isolationist foreign policy. The US should stay out of the war. Now, that's not to say that the US wasn't afraid of making a little bit of money off of the war, and they did. The US did trade with the Allied powers, England and France especially. JP Morgan loaned a couple $1 billion to the Allies. They also sent ships to the Allies and some ammunition. Now, this did not technically violate the neutrality proclamation of Woodrow Wilson, because Germany was free to trade with the US if they wanted to, but they couldn't because England had created a naval blockade preventing any German ships from getting past England. And so for all intents and purposes, the US was allied with England and France because that's the only people they traded with, but officially they are neutral. So again, most Americans supported neutrality and isolationism, but the US did trade with the Allies. Again, that's England and France. Now, kind of getting us to what actually forced the US to join the war, unrestricted submarine warfare was one of the biggest factors. Germany had developed the Unterseeboot, the U-boat or submarine, and with this German submarine, they began to kind of menace the British trading routes. They declared unrestricted submarine warfare. We will attack and sink any ship, regardless of flag, regardless of cargo, regardless of civilian or military, hoping to break the British blockade. Hundreds, thousands of ships were killed, most famously the Lusitania, which was a British passenger ship, killing 1,200 people, 126 Americans. It turns out that the Lusitania actually was carrying ammunition to England, hidden below deck, and the Lusitania was kind of using the civilian passengers as cover to get that ammo across. But regardless, Germany sinks a British passenger ship, kills 126 Americans, and the Americans are pissed. Now, at this point, the US does not join the war. Germany, Germany pinky swear promised, I promise not to sink any unarmed ships without warning you first. Okay, sure. And so this doesn't force the US to join yet. We'll get to what forces the US to join the Zimmermann telegram in a moment. Okay, now back to those economic links to Britain and France. The US again was officially neutral, but they had been trading with England and France for the longest time, and so that trade continued. When World War I starts in 1914, the US was technically in an economic recession or an economic downturn, but by 1 year later, 1915, they've turned that around because of war trade with England and France. In terms of public opinion, again, the US was officially neutral, unofficially trading with the Allies, England and France. It kind of varied. Native-born Americans, I suppose the quote-unquote old immigrants, native-born Americans were generally pro-Allied powers. They wanted England and France to win because many of the immigrants to America came from England. But more recent immigrants, first and second generation immigrants, well, they supported the country based on kind of where they came from. German Americans wanted the US to support Germany. Irish Americans, well, many Irish fled Ireland because of persecution by the British, and so they hated the British. So they supported Germany and the Central Powers. Italian Americans, you might remember Italy switched sides. It's kind of shady. Italian Americans, they supported the Allies as well once Italy switched sides. And so again, this question of should the US joined, we'll say many Americans were divided. Native-born Americans were generally pro-Allies, England and France, but recent immigrants often supported Germany or the Central Powers. So there was certainly some division within the US. Now, even before the US joined the war officially, they began to prepare for war, knowing that they might be forced into a war at some point, and we said militarism didn't really apply, so they had to get ready. There was some debate over whether the US should prepare for war when they were officially during peacetime. Woodrow Wilson's own party, the Democrats, opposed preparedness, but Woodrow Wilson, largely because he realized how serious it would be if the US was forced into war unprepared, does begin to shift the US towards a more prepared state. The National Defense Act increases the regular army size to 175,000 people and also approves the construction of 50 warships. Compare this to how many soldiers Germany has, in the millions. Well, the US isn't going to be able to full on fight a war, but at least they've got the basics to be ready for war. So again, even before the US joins, the US begins to prepare for war. And we'll add here the National Defense Act of 1916, adds 175,000 soldiers, if I can type right, and 50 warships. Again, just getting ready. There were many anti-war Americans, and it's perhaps what you would expect. Many of the populists and the progressives and the socialists and the suffragists, all of those leaders of the progressive era who were fighting for reforms, they oftentimes opposed war. So I'll just say, in general, like progressive era reformers often opposed war. Although once the US officially joins the war, they'll change their tune. By 1916, there is a presidential election. Europe is in the middle of war. The US is officially neutral, and they're holding an election. The Democrats renominated Woodrow Wilson. He ran on the ticket. He kept us out of war, which is going to be really awkward when he joins the war 5 or 6 months after the election, but okay. The Republicans nominated Charles Hughes as Supreme Court Justice. And you can see from an incredibly close election, Woodrow Wilson just barely squeaks by. 51% of the popular vote, 277 to 254. Really, he wins by 1 state. Woodrow Wilson wins on the platform, he kept us out of war. Well, the next year is going to force him into war. The events that finally forced the US to join the war, again, Germany had this policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. They sank the Lusitania and other ships, which angered the US, but didn't force them into the war yet. Lusitania was sunk in 1915. But things began to change in 1917 with the discovery of what's called the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram was sent by the German ambassador to Mexico. And in the telegram, I'll just read the excerpt here. Germany writes to the Mexicans, "We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor in spite of this to keep the US neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona as well." And so Germany proposes an alliance to Mexico. They say, ally with us. Attack the US, distract them so that the US can't fight here. And once we win the war, we'll get you your land back. It's a little bit of a desperate play. Germany was very worried about the US joining. Now, this telegram was discovered. I believe it was discovered by the British, and it was decoded because it was written in a code. And this is what finally forces the US's hand. The US basically realized, okay, like we've been trying to stay out of it, but even though we're officially neutral, Germany is basically declaring war on us with this. April 1917, Congress finally officially declares war on Germany. So kind of what forces the US to join the war? So US joins the war in 1917. 2 key events. First, Germany sank the Lusitania and other American ships, kind of all the way back to 1915, but that isn't what forced it. Zimmermann telegram is what really forces the US to join the war, because Germany tried to get Mexico basically to attack the US. Forces the US to join the war. Another one of those German plans backfiring. If you remember the Schlieffen plan, Germany tried to sneak through Belgium to get to France, thought it would take them 4 weeks, then they'd take on the Russians. Well, Germany fought for 4 years against France, 3 years against Russia. So another of those German military plans backfiring. All right. So the US has joined the war in 1917. They won't actually send troops until 1918. So we're going to focus mostly on the home front for the rest of today. First, the US had a huge slew of war propaganda. They created a group called the Committee on Public Information. They created posters, pamphlets, movies, and songs, and stage shows to convince Americans to support the war. Eventually, there will be a draft, but much of American support for the war was on a volunteer basis, not on a law. So you can see, eat more cheese, you'll need less meat. We're saving you, so you save food, asking people to ration so that soldiers can have more food. Some other famous propaganda posters: destroy this mad brute, depicting the Germans as a savage King Kong-like creature. And gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy. Be a man and do it. Kind of playing up to man's, I don't know, masculinity, I guess, to try to encourage them to join the war. And then beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. A Liberty bond was a war bond. Basically, people would basically loan money to the government. They'd be called Liberty bonds as a way to rile up some patriotism. And then war gardens over the top. The seeds of victory ensure the fruits of peace. People were encouraged to have their own war gardens to grow food that they could send to the front line or eat themselves. Hopefully these propaganda images looking familiar to last year. So we'll add a few details here. The Committee on Public Information creates lots of propaganda. Some other challenges, I guess, on the home front was the Espionage and Sedition Acts. This might sound somewhat familiar. You might remember the Alien and Sedition Acts with John Adams back in 1800 or so. Once the US finally joins the war, kind of anti-German hysteria sweeps across the nation because the US is officially allied against Germany. And the Espionage and Sedition Acts say any criticism of the government or any criticism of the war is illegal. You can be censored and you can even be punished if you criticize the government or criticize the war. This really creepy propaganda poster, I pledge allegiance and silence about the war, encouraging people not to expose secrets, perhaps. About 2,000 people were prosecuted. You can see many of them were socialists and union leaders, including Eugene V. Debs, who was probably the biggest union leader and biggest socialist in America. Now, this might seem incredibly, unconstitutional and illegal, but in the Supreme Court case Schenck versus United States, the Supreme Court ruled that freedom of speech can be revoked or taken away if it presents a clear and present danger to the nation. The best example of this is you are not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. You're not allowed to yell bomb in an airport. That type of language would create a clear and present danger. Same argument is being proposed or presented with Donald Trump. He has freedom of speech, sure, but when he encouraged his supporters to attack the Capitol, that created a clear and present danger, perhaps, and maybe perhaps was illegal. So we have the Espionage, and oops, if I can spell it right, and Sedition Acts, 1917, made it illegal to criticize the government and criticize the war. It was found constitutional because it created a clear and present danger. And about 2000 or 1900 were prosecuted. And again, these were oftentimes socialists, union leaders, people that the government didn't necessarily like. And so was this an excuse for them, for the government to imprison these people? Perhaps. Work, factory life also changed drastically for a couple of reasons. First, the federal government ended up playing a huge role. They created something called the War Industries Board. The federal government basically took a central role in planning the economy during the war. It's no longer capitalist, no longer free to do what you want. Rather, the government's going to tell you what to make. We have something today called the Defense Production Act that that Biden has been using to get companies to make vaccines, for example. Same thing will happen in World War II. Now, the main union leaders ended up supporting the war, and they officially discouraged strikes during the war because, if people are striking, then they can't create supplies for soldiers. But there were still 6,000 strikes during the war, and so these conflicts and struggles will continue. Some women did work in weapons factories. This can become more World War II thing in America, but that was somewhat common. So again, with economics, federal government takes a central role in planning the economy. This is called the War Industries Board. And union leaders supported the war, but strikes continue. Some other effects on the home front. First, okay, all of these men who are going to war, they leave behind their factory jobs. So who takes their place? Women. Thousands of women filled the jobs left by men. And so women, after the war was over, they were able to finally successfully advocate for the vote. The 19th Amendment gave women the vote in 1920. And it was, I suppose, a reward, Woodrow Wilson would maybe call it that, for their vitally necessary war measure. Their contributions proved that they were valuable, and so it was vitally necessary to give women the vote. As women gained the vote, men were also forced to register for the draft. The US, remember, they had like 175,000 soldiers or so by like 1916. And so all men 18 to 45 were required to register for the draft. The draft still exists today. Hasn't officially been used since the 1970s, but the draft does still officially exist. So kind of see some effects on different genders there. Men were required to register for the draft. Women won the vote after the war. This is the 19th Amendment in 1920. So America goes to war in 1917. Within months, they've got an army of 4 million men, including some African Americans and women who African Americans would typically serve in segregated Black-only units. But they wouldn't arrive at the front line until a year later in 1918. When American troops do finally arrive in Europe, they kind of turn the tide, one of many turning points that leads to the Allies winning the war. And so the war finally ends on November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. German, French, and English leaders signed a treaty on a train car in France. Germany is forced to surrender. Kaiser Wilhelm II is forced to step down. And the world is left to kind of pick up the pieces. 9 million dead, 20 million wounded on both sides. The Spanish flu that will come right after kills 30 million more within the next year. The US had far fewer casualties. I want to say they had about 150,000, largely because they had a smaller force and they joined late. And so World War I is not going to have a devastating, life-changing effect on Americans like it does on the English. For the English and for the French, an entire generation of young men were lost. They were actually called the lost generation. And so in Europe, for the English and French, it was a historic moment that changed the lives of every single family in every single town. In America, not as much. They only fought for a few months. They only officially joined the war for about a year and a half. And so we'll see some of the effects of that back home. And so when we kind of zoom out, America kind of is one of the main turning points for the Allies. They send food, they send weapons, they send money, they send oil. Sure, they send men and soldiers, but they really are the turning point. So I'm going to add this for the US joins World War I. The US entry is the turning point that leads to an Allied victory. So even though the US joined so late, they're really seen as one of the leaders of the world. Woodrow Wilson seen as one of the leaders of the world. And so after the war is over, the Paris Peace Conference is held. The war ends in November of 1918. January of 1919, Woodrow Wilson sails across the Atlantic to Paris to try to create peace. It's called the Treaty of Versailles. And Woodrow Wilson presents his 14 points. And we read this last year, whether you were in world history or AP Euro. Freedom of navigation upon the seas, disarmament to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety, and a general association of nations to settle disputes. Woodrow Wilson's main goal here is peace, long-term, long-lasting peace. So we'll say here his goal is peace and stability. How does he do that? Well, he says that we should have no more secret treaties. We should have freedom of navigation upon the seas. We should have disarmament, disarming. We should have self-determination. Each group can, each country, each nationality can decide for themselves whether they want to be independent or not. And a League of Nations to settle future disputes. Woodrow Wilson, controversial character because he was actually a crazy white supremacist and a racist, is oftentimes lauded and celebrated for these notions of self-determination, independence, and trying to create a long-lasting peace. At the Paris Peace Conference, again, Woodrow Wilson sails across the Atlantic there. And Woodrow Wilson's kind of the odd man out. The countries, the European countries that had fought and suffered so long, England, France, Italy, they want to punish Germany. They want more power for themselves to defend themselves against a future German threat. And so think back, hopefully, to the debate that we had last year in either World History or AP Euro. If you were Germany in that debate, you were probably pissed off because everybody ganged up on you and you had to pay reparations and whatnot. What does the peace treaty say? Germany has to disarm. Max army of 100,000 soldiers, if I'm remembering right. Germany has to give up all of their colonies that were oftentimes given to the English and French. They had to admit guilt. They had to sign the guilt clause. They had to pay a huge amount of reparations, billions or trillions of dollars in reparations today. Sorry, I think it's $30 billion in today's money. And they were occupied along the border by the French for 15 years. Now, that notion of self-determination was applied to some of the German Empire. Some new states are created, and the League of Nations is created as well. So let's get at the actual Treaty of Versailles. What does it do? Well, it punishes Germany. They have to admit guilt. They have to pay reparations. They had to disarm, if I can spell reparations right. They had to disarm, and they had to give up colonies. And it also creates the League of Nations. But, and you might remember this, the US did not join the League of Nations. The very idea that Woodrow Wilson came up with, the US does not join. The reason why, well, the US has a separation of powers. The president only has so much power. It actually turns out that it's Congress's job, it's the Senate's job to approve of treaties with foreign nations. Woodrow Wilson comes home, he gives all of these speeches encouraging the US to join the League of Nations. And most senators say no. We got pulled into a war halfway across the world. It didn't really have anything to do with us. If we join the League of Nations, we're going to get dragged into future wars. And so the US retreats within itself again. They become an isolationist nation again. So we'll say creates the League of Nations, but the US does not join. They want to maintain isolationism as much as they can. And so we'll get to some of these stories in the aftermath. In the US, we see increased partisanship after the war, both sides of American politics fighting each other. We see the US Army demobilizing or getting rid of their army. We see the Red Scare and Palmer raids, attacks on communists and socialists after the Russian Revolution. And then future conflicts, both labor conflicts and race riots. So the US kind of pulls the Band-Aid off of a lot of problems and tensions within the country. And so as we wrap up here, again, we have the context of the war, the debate over whether the US should join, and even before they joined, they were clearly on the Allies' side. And then what I think is probably most significant here is the effect of the war on the home front. The federal government taking an increased role, the Espionage and Sedition Acts being one example of the federal government gaining more power, and then the effects on workers, women working in the factories getting the vote, and then the draft as well, kind of significantly changing many people's lives.